The winter banquet was supposed to be the night he reaffirmed their fated bond before the entire pack. Instead, it became the moment. Elara Thorne's entire world shattered. The main feasting hall of Ironwood Keep was suffocatingly warm, thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the heavy, earthy aroma of wolf shifters in their prime. Hundreds of candles cast flickering, golden light across the ancient stone walls, illuminating the banners of the Ironwood pack. At the high table, Elara sat with a straight spine. She wore the traditional lunar silks, a flowing cascade of silver and pale moonlight, the delicate fabric resting softly against her skin. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was composed, an elegant mask crafted through years of duty and devotion. Beneath the silk, however, her skin was freezing. Gavin Ironwood, the Alpha King, sat beside her. He radiated power and brutal authority. His massive frame was clad in dark furs and boiled leather, smelling of winter frost and sharp iron, yet he had not looked at her once since the feast began. He had not offered his hand. He had not brushed his shoulder against hers. The space between them on the grand wooden bench felt as vast and unbridgeable as a frozen lake. Elara's inner wolf paced restlessly in the dark corners of her mind. A low, anxious whine vibrated through her ribs. Something was terribly wrong. The mating mark on the curve of her neck, a crescent moon etched in jagged lines, each with a dull, throbbing cold. It did not burn with the protective heat of an alpha's love. It felt like dead, black ice. Below the dais, the court revelled in the harvest celebrations. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Goblets clashed. Elara's storm-grey eyes drifted inevitably toward the edge of the high table, where Cynthia Sterling stood. Cynthia was beautiful in the way a poisoned blade was beautiful. Her hair was a cascade of spun gold. Her lips painted a deep, triumphant crimson. She wore a gown of silver and grey, colours that bordered dangerously on royal privilege. Cynthia ignored the feast. She looked only at Gavin, and when the Alpha King finally stood, the heavy wooden legs of his chair scraping violently against the stone floor, Cynthia offered a slow, calculated smile. The immense chamber fell silent. The music ground to a halt. The clatter of plates ceased. Hundreds of predatory eyes turned toward the high table, sensing the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. Gavin raised his cup, not in a toast. He slammed it down onto the heavy oak wood. The loud crack echoed like a gunshot. "My people," Gavin's voice boomed, deep and resonant, carrying the crushing weight of his command. "The Ironwood Keep has stood for centuries. We are a pack built on strength, on legacy, and on blood. We revere the old ways. We honor the fertility of our lands and the future of our bloodlines." Elara kept her chin lifted. Her breath moved evenly in and out of her lungs. She did not tremble, though the ice in her mark began to spread down her collarbone, numbing her chest. "A king requires a queen who can bear the weight of his legacy," Gavin continued. He turned his head slowly, his amber eyes locking onto Elara. There was no warmth in his gaze. There was no hesitation, only a cold, ruthless calculation. "And a pack requires a Luna who can bring life into this world." A collective murmur rippled through the hall. Elara's heart performed a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. "Elara Thorne," Gavin said. He spoke her maiden name, not her mated title, not his Luna, just Elara Thorne. "For 3 years you have sat beside me. For 3 years we have waited for the blessing of an heir. The healers have spoken. The seers have cast their bones. Your blood is stagnant. Your womb is a frozen wasteland. You carry a barren curse." The words struck her physically like the blunt edge of a broadsword against her sternum. A barren curse. The ultimate humiliation in a society that worshipped physical vitality and breeding. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Some pointed. Some covered their mouths. A few, loyal to Cynthia's faction, offered cruel, mocking laughter. Elara sat perfectly still. She did not shrink back from the thousands of eyes tearing into her flesh. She did not raise her hands to cover her face. She focused on the grain of the wooden table in front of her. She focused on the heat of the candles. She forced her body to remain an immovable statue of silent dignity. Her wolf bared its teeth, snarling against the injustice. Elara clamped down on the instinct to fight. To fight was to show weakness. To beg was to admit defeat. Gavin moved closer to her. He loomed over her sitting form, casting a long, dark shadow that swallowed the golden light. "Your touch brings no life," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly over the muttering crowd. "You are a hollow vessel, and I will not doom my pack to wither alongside you. Therefore, before the ancestors and the Bloodsworn, I strip you of the lunar title." He reached down. His large, rough hand grabbed the delicate silver lunar veil pinned to her dark hair. He did not unfasten it gently. He ripped it away. The sharp pins tore a few strands of her hair, scratching her scalp. A tiny bead of blood welled up near her temple. Yet Elara did not flinch. She simply looked up at him. Her storm-grey eyes were clear, dry, and terrifyingly calm. "I demand you yield," Gavin commanded. His jaw clenched, perhaps unsettled by her total lack of hysteria. He had expected tears. He had expected her to fall to her knees, clinging to his boots, begging for his mercy, begging him not to sever their bond. Every woman in the pack would have broken. Every Omega would have shattered. Elara, however, did not. She stood up. The movement was fluid, graceful, and unhurried. She smoothed the front of her silver silk dress with steady hands. She looked past Gavin's broad shoulder and met Cynthia's gaze. The antagonist's triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, unsettled by the sheer cold void in Elara's expression. "I accept." 2 words. Spoken quietly, with such absolute clarity that they rang through the silent hall like the tolling of an iron bell. Gavin's eyes widened slightly. His nostrils flared. He had wanted a victory. He had wanted a dominant display of his power over a weak, pleading mate. Instead, he was met with a wall of impenetrable ice. "You accept," Gavin repeated, his voice dangerously low, practically a growl. "I accept your decree, Alpha," Elara said, her tone completely devoid of emotion. She did not call him her king. She did not call him her mate. "If my presence brings you no life, then I will take my shadow elsewhere." Gavin's pride recoiled at her swift capitulation. It felt less like a submission and more like a dismissal. His face darkened with fury. He turned sharply toward the center of the dais and extended a hand toward the floor. "Cynthia Sterling," the Alpha announced, his voice vibrating with defensive anger. "Come forward." The golden-haired woman glided up the wooden stairs, her dress rustling softly. She placed her small manicured hand into Gavin's massive palm. He pulled her close, wrapping a heavy arm around her waist, possessing her in front of the entire pack. "Cynthia carries the true blessing of the ancestors," Gavin proclaimed. "She is fertile, she is strong, she will be your new Luna." He took the silver veil he had torn from Elara's head and draped it over his new favorite's hair. The crowd erupted into cheers and howls. The sound was deafening, a visceral, animalistic celebration of the new matriarch, the very people Elara had spent 3 years protecting, feeding, and healing were now screaming for her replacement. Elara stood beside the throne, ignored. The mating mark on her neck burned with a sudden, vicious agony, as if a branding iron had been pressed into her flesh. Gavin was publicly severing the spiritual tie, overriding the fated bond with his alpha mandate. The physical pain was excruciating. Her vision swam with black spots. Her lungs seized, fighting for oxygen in the stuffy, meat-scented air. Yet she kept her spine straight. She did not touch the burning mark. She did not sway. She locked her knees, digging her fingernails into her own palms until the skin broke and warm blood slicked her fingers. The physical pain in her hands grounded her, keeping her from collapsing. "Take off the silk," Gavin ordered, turning back to Elara with a sneer. He wanted to break her. He needed to see her break to validate his cruelty. You are no longer fit to wear the colors of the high house. You are a barren servant. You will wear the grey linen dress, and you will serve in the outer courtyard, so that everyone may see what becomes of a hollow vessel. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten. The outer courtyard was where you went to be broken in plain sight. It was the lowest tier of the keep, a place of freezing mud, raw labor, and endless humiliation. "As you command," she said softly. She did not wait for his guards. She turned on her heel and walked away from the high table. She walked down the long, narrow aisle between the feasting tables. The cheering died down as she passed. The pack members shrank back slightly, unnerved by her posture. She moved like a queen ascending a scaffold, her head held high, her gaze fixed entirely on the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Behind her, she heard Gavin laugh at something Cynthia whispered. She heard the clinking of goblets. She heard the sound of her own life being erased. Elara did not cry. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind her, shutting out the warmth and the light, she walked into the freezing stone corridors of the servant quarters. Her blood was cold. Her bond was severed. Her spine remained unbent. The biting wind of the outer courtyard whipped violently through the open arches of the stone walls, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow. It was 2 days later. The harvest festival had ended, leaving behind a bitter, unforgiving chill that signaled the onset of the deep freeze. The sky was the color of bruised iron, heavy with the threat of winter storms. Elara knelt on the frozen cobblestones beside the massive stone water wells. She wore the grey linen dress. The fabric was coarse, woven from cheap, scratching fibers that offered no protection against the winter elements. It hung loosely on her frame, a stark, dull grey that drained the color from her pale skin. Her feet were shoved into thin leather boots that had already soaked through with freezing mud. She was hauling water. It was the most brutal, punishing task in the keep. The great wells drew from deep, subterranean reserves, and the heavy iron buckets had to be hauled up hand over hand using thick frost-covered hemp ropes. Elara reached forward, grabbing the thick rope. The coarse fibers were slick with ice. Her bare hands were a map of physical suffering. Her knuckles were split, the skin raw and bleeding. Her palms were covered in bursting blisters from the relentless friction. Every time she closed her fingers around the frozen rope, a sharp, electric pain shot up her forearms, settling deep in her aching shoulders. She gritted her teeth and pulled. The heavy iron bucket scraped against the stone walls of the deep well, echoing like a hollow groan from the earth. She leaned back, using the dead weight of her body to haul the water upward. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, sharp and ragged. The cold was absolute. It seeped through the thin grey linen, burrowing into her muscles, freezing the marrow in her bones. The severed mark on her neck throbbed constantly in the cold. It was a phantom limb of pain, reminding her of the warmth she had lost. Every inch of her skin felt brittle, as if a sudden blow would shatter her into 1,000 frozen pieces. "Hold there," a harsh voice barked from across the courtyard. One of the guards stood near the blacksmith's forge, holding a mug of steaming ale. He laughed, nudging his companion. "Look at the barren Luna, hauling water like a common mule. See if her touch freezes the well, eh?" Elara did not look up. She did not acknowledge the taunt. She kept her eyes fixed on the fraying fibers of the rope. She pulled again, hand over hand. The muscles in her back screamed in protest. Her wolf lay utterly silent in her mind, curled into a tight ball of preservation, conserving every ounce of energy just to survive the plummeting temperatures. Finally, the rim of the bucket crested the edge of the stone well. Elara lunged forward, grabbing the freezing handle. The metal bit viciously into her raw palms. She hauled the bucket over the lip, letting it hit the cobblestones with a heavy slosh. The dark, freezing water spilled over the edges, splashing onto the hem of her coarse uniform. The fabric instantly stiffened, freezing against her shins. She collapsed back onto her heels, her chest heaving, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The stone beneath her knees was unforgiving, radiating a numbing chill that threatened to stop the circulation in her legs. She stared down at the bucket. The water was black and perfectly still, mirroring the grey sky above. She reached out, her trembling, bloodied fingers hovering just above the surface. For a strange, fleeting second, the water seemed to ripple, though there was no wind. A faint, impossible warmth brushed against her fingertips. She closed her eyes, seeking that tiny, microscopic source of heat, imagining the deep, ancient hum of the subterranean rivers far below the ice. "You're going to lose your fingers to the frostbite, my lady." The whisper was barely audible over the howling wind. Elara opened her eyes. Martha Green, a senior maid from the inner keep, stood a few paces away. She carried a basket of soiled linens, her head bowed low to avoid drawing the attention of the guards. Martha was a quiet, compassionate woman with greying hair and kind, tired eyes. She had served the former Luna faithfully when Elara wore the silver silks, and though it was strictly forbidden to show sympathy to the disgraced, the older woman could not entirely look away. Martha shuffled closer, pretending to examine a stain on a bedsheet. Underneath the fabric, she slipped a small, tightly wrapped cloth parcel onto the stone edge of the well. "It's boiled potato and a bit of salt pork," the maid murmured, her lips barely moving. "Eat it fast, before they see." Elara looked at the small parcel. The faint scent of warm starch and grease reached her nose, causing her stomach to cramp violently. She hadn't eaten anything but thin gruel in 3 days. Her body was starving, consuming its own muscle to keep her core temperature from dropping to fatal levels. "Thank you, Martha," Elara whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. She swiftly slid the food into the deep pocket of her dress. She did not eat it immediately. To eat openly was to invite a beating. She would save it for the absolute dark of night, in the freezing hay of the stable where she slept. Martha kept her eyes downcast, her hands anxiously wringing the soiled linen. "You shouldn't be out here. The winter storms are closing in. A body can't survive this labor on the outer rim, not a body as delicate as yours." "I am surviving," Elara replied flatly. She grabbed the handle of the bucket, preparing to lift it and carry it to the wash-house. "They don't want you to survive," the maid said, her voice trembling slightly. She cast a terrified glance toward the high keep, where the warm, golden windows of the Alpha's chambers glowed against the grey sky. "Sitzia, she is moving your things to the fire pits. She is burning the last of your books. She wears your silver, my lady. And the king, he lets her." Elara's jaw tightened. The mention of Cynthia wearing her silks did not bring tears. It brought a cold, hard clarity. Let her wear the silver. It will not keep her warm when the true winter comes. "You don't understand," Martha pleaded, leaning in a fraction closer, the scent of lye soap and fear rolling off her. "Gavin is furious. He thought you would break. He thought you would cry outside his door, begging to be a concubine, begging for scraps of his bond. Your silence is maddening him. He feels challenged." "My silence is my own," Elara said, her tone resolute, though her lips were blue with cold. "It is the only thing he cannot strip away." "He will find a way," Martha warned, tears welling in her eyes. "He is looking for a reason to banish you into the death forest. Or worse. They are whispering. The new favorite tells the court that your barrenness is infectious, that your presence in the courtyard will sour the spring planting. She wants you gone permanently." Elara stared into the black water of the iron bucket. The reflection of her own face looked back at her. Her cheekbones were hollow, her skin pale as a corpse, her storm-grey eyes sunken in deep, bruised shadows. She looked like a ghost. She looked exactly like a woman who had been thrown away to die. Beneath the exhaustion, beneath the physical agony of the torn muscles and the frozen blood, there was a steady, unyielding core of absolute iron. "Martha," Elara said quietly, reaching out with one bloodied hand to gently touch the maid's wrist. The older woman gasped slightly at the freezing temperature of Elara's skin. "Do not risk yourself for me again. If the guards catch you, they will whip you. I am already broken in their eyes. There is no need for two of us to bleed, but who will protect you?" The maid whispered, a single tear escaping and freezing on her cheek. Elara slowly pulled her hand back. She looked at her raw, split knuckles. She thought of the searing pain of the severed bond. She thought of the high table, the laughter, the torn veil. "No one," Elara said. The words were a simple, devastating fact. "We are small things in a world of teeth. I will carry the water. I will endure the frost, because that is what a survivor does." Martha let out a stifled sob, turning away quickly and hurrying back toward the servant entrances, clutching her basket to her chest, as if it could shield her from the cruelty of the ironwood keep. Elara was left alone again with the biting wind. She wrapped her freezing fingers around the heavy handle. With a sharp exhale, she hoisted the brutal weight against her hip. The frozen linen of her skirt tore at her raw skin as she walked. Pace by pace, over the slick, treacherous cobblestones, she did not know that a shift was coming in the wind. A phantom scent of sulphur and a microscopic spark of warmth suddenly brushed through the frozen air, cutting the chill with the faint, sharp tang of distant embers. She did not know that across the eastern mountains, Ignis Valerius, a sovereign of fire and gold, was currently marching toward the borders, riding to sign the Burning Gold Treaty. She didn't know the man approaching had buried enemies in ash and ruled an empire of pure heat. All she knew was the terrible, crushing weight of the cold iron and the silent promise she made to herself with every agonizing stride. "I will not break." She reached the massive wooden tubs of the wash-house and poured the black water in. It splashed over the sides, pooling around her boots. She wiped her forehead with the back of her bleeding hand, leaving a faint smear of crimson on her pale skin. She turned around, facing the howling wind, and walked back to the freezing well to pull the rope again, and again, and again. Her hands bled, her back ached, her breath frosted in the air. Her dignity remained a flawless, impenetrable shield against the dark. She was Elara Thorne. She was no longer a Luna, but she was not a victim. She was a woman waiting in the ice. And the cold was only a season. Every muscle in her body trembled as she reached for the hemp rope once more. The physical deterioration was rapid, terrifying in its relentless progression. The lack of food, combined with the extreme metabolic toll of a severed fated bond, was slowly shutting down her internal organs. The books in the High Library claimed that an Omega rejected by an Alpha would wither and die of a broken heart within a month. Elara's heart wasn't broken. It was encased in a block of ice, beating slowly, rhythmically, refusing to stop. As she pulled the next bucket up, the sky above finally broke. Small, hard flakes of snow began to fall, spiraling down like ash from a dead fire. They landed on her dark hair, melting instantly against her scalp, sending fresh streams of freezing water down her neck. She closed her eyes, letting the snow hit her face. It felt almost gentle compared to the harshness of the stones and the ropes. For a moment, just a single quiet moment, she let herself imagine a hearth. She imagined a roaring fire of golden embers, the scent of cedar and wood smoke, the heavy, safe weight of a thick fur cloak draped over her shivering shoulders. She imagined a heat so intense it could melt the black ice in her veins. The heavy bucket crested the well. The iron clanged sharply against the stone, shattering her quiet fantasy. Elara opened her eyes. The grey courtyard was still there. The mocking guards were still there. The biting frost was real. She hauled the bucket over the edge. She would pull the water. She would survive the day. And when the night came, she would lie in the darkness and guard the absolute, undeniable truth of her own worth. They could take her crown. They could take her warmth. But they could never ever make her beg. The biting wind of the exposed bailey suddenly died. It did not fade away naturally, trailing off into a gentle, settling breeze. It was abruptly suffocated, as if a massive, invisible hand had clamped down over the entirety of the ironwood keep. The sky, previously the color of bruised iron and heavy with the threat of a winter blizzard, took on a strange, unnatural amber hue. The ambient light shifted, bleeding away the stark, depressing grey of the winter afternoon and replacing it with the heavy, golden gloom of a forge fire. Elara stood beside the frozen stone well, her raw, bleeding hands still gripping the coarse hemp rope. She paused, her chest heaving with deep, ragged exhaustion. The air pressure plummeted, pressing against her eardrums with a distinct physical weight. A low, rhythmic vibration began to hum through the frosted cobblestones. It travelled up through the thin, soaked soles of her leather boots, vibrating through her aching calves and rattling the marrow in her bones. It was not the marching of an ordinary pack army. It was the approach of a natural disaster. For the past 3 days, her world had been defined by the excruciating cold. The severed mating mark on the curve of her neck had become a black void, radiating a chill that threatened to stop her heart entirely. Her inner wolf lay utterly silent, curled into a tight ball of preservation, suppressing its own natural instincts just to keep her vital organs functioning. The concept of the barren curse was not merely a social demotion in a society that worshipped physical vitality. It was a spiritual death sentence. Yet, as the deep vibration grew louder, the freezing temperature of the courtyard began to aggressively fracture. The massive iron-reinforced gates of the outer courtyard groaned loudly. The heavy hinges screamed as they were forced open by the terrified castle guards. The sentries themselves were backing away hastily, their faces pale, their hands trembling on the wooden shafts of their spears. They were wolves, apex predators in their own rugged terrain, but their primal instincts were screaming at them to immediately submit. A physical wave of heat crashed into the courtyard. It washed over the stones, violently contrasting with the bitter winter chill. The thick, spidery patterns of ice that coated the defensive walls instantly wept into water. The dark, freezing water inside the iron bucket at Elara's feet hissed, the surface dancing frantically as it began to steam. The scent hit her next. It was an overwhelming olfactory assault that obliterated the foul smell of wet mud, dirty animal pelts, and freezing rain. It was the crisp scent of cedar wood, sharp and clean, heavily mixed with the intoxicating aroma of wood smoke, and something rich, metallic, and infinitely dangerous. It smelled like burning gold. The Fire Dragon Emperor had arrived. Ignis Valerius rode at the center of his imperial vanguard. He sat atop a massive, obsidian-scaled warhorse that was bred in the volcanic mountain ranges of the deep south. The magnificent beast breathed faint wisps of grey smoke into the chilling air, its heavy hooves striking the stone like rolling thunder. The Emperor himself was a terrifying portrait of absolute, lethal power. He was a sovereign who had built his vast empire on the smoking ashes of those who foolishly defied him. No woman ever survived him, the northern rumors wildly claimed. He was a pure force of nature, untamable and fundamentally destructive. He wore thick armor forged from darkened steel, intricately veined with actual gold that seemed to pulse and glow with an intense inner heat. He did not wear a crown of jewels. He wore a jagged iron crown that sat heavily on his dark hair. But it was the chains that drew Elara's sharp attention. Around his thick, muscular forearms, Ignis wore heavy chains of black, cold iron. They were completely unsecured, wrapping loosely around his wrists like brutal, barbaric bracelets. They were not the chains of a defeated prisoner. They were a deliberate, self-imposed restraint, a physical, public reminder to the entire realm that he voluntarily checked his own apocalyptic power. He was a king who spent every waking moment holding back the fire that could effortlessly consume the world. His face was a masterpiece of harsh, unforgiving angles, beautiful the way a blade was beautiful. His eyes were storm glass grey, but as he scanned the filthy courtyard, the edges of his irises constantly shifted to a predatory molten gold. He spared no glance for the ironwood keep with any trace of awe or respect. He looked at it as if he were patiently deciding which watchtower to burn first. The grand double doors of the inner keep slammed open. Alpha King Gavin Ironwood rushed out, frantically flanked by his elite royal guard. Gavin wore his thickest, most impressive winter furs, his broad chest puffed out as he desperately tried to project the image of a dominant, untouchable northern warlord. But the visual contrast was pathetic. Next to the sheer, elemental gravity of the southern sovereign, the Alpha King looked desperately small. He looked like a fragile man playing with dry matches while a volcano erupted directly behind him. Beside Gavin walked Cynthia Sterling. She wore Elara's lunar silks. The delicate silver fabric fluttered uselessly in the strange, hot wind, sweeping violently through the courtyard. Despite the heavy fur cloak draped over her slender shoulders, Cynthia visibly shivered. Her body, lacking any true ancient magic, was rejecting the sudden, overwhelming shift in the atmospheric pressure. She plastered a sweet, calculated smile on her face, trying desperately to exude the fertile, gentle grace of a high-born queen. Ignis pulled back sharply on the heavy leather reins. His warhorse halted with a violent, smoking snort. The Emperor dismounted in one fluid, terrifyingly heavy motion. His boots struck the stone courtyard, and the deep sound echoed like a heavy hammer dropping on a steel anvil. He did not bow to the Alpha. He did not offer his hand in polite greeting. He simply stood there, an unmoving monolith of heat and iron. "Emperor Valeris," Gavin announced, forcing his booming voice to sound steady, though it entirely lacked its usual absolute confidence. "The Ironwood Keep welcomes you. We are deeply honored to host the signing of the Burning Gold Treaty. Our lands are yours to walk." Ignis stared down at Gavin. He did not speak immediately. The silence stretched, agonizing, suffocating, and incredibly tense. The Emperor's nostrils flared slightly. He was taking in the scent of the anxious Alpha, the scent of the terrified royal guards, and the cloying, perfumed scent of the fake Luna standing beside him. He smelled the deep, systemic rot festering in the pack. He smelled the arrogance of a weak man who foolishly discarded sacred things for immediate political gain. But then, the wind suddenly shifted. A drastically different scent cut sharply through the stench of Gavin's pride. It was buried deep beneath the smell of wet stone, cold labor, and cheap grey fabric, but to a dragon's highly evolved senses it was pure. It smelled of winter ice, profound loss, and an ancient, sleeping magic that had not been awakened for centuries. Ignis turned his head slowly. The movement was deliberate, intensely predatory. He looked past the posturing Alpha King, past the nervously twitching royal guards, and stared directly into the darkest, coldest corner of the lower yard. He saw her. Elara Thorne stood quietly beside the freezing stone well, her boots sinking deeply into the freezing mud. She wore the humiliating servant's attire, a coarse, degrading garment specifically designed to strip a woman of her royal identity and break her spirit. Her hands were severely bruised, swollen, and slick with her own raw blood from hauling the heavy iron buckets. She looked exactly like a woman who had been thrown away into the dark to die, but her posture defied the degradation. Her spine was straight. She did not cower against the damp stone wall. She did not lower her chin in trembling fear in the presence of the ultimate predator. She stood with her shoulders pulled back, her storm-grey eyes meeting his molten gold gaze with a profound, terrifying calm. She possessed the quiet, unbreakable dignity of a true queen. The moment their eyes locked, the world ceased to exist for Elara, the severed mating mark on her neck violently convulsed. It did not ache with the agonizing, tearing pain of Gavin's cruel rejection. Instead, a sudden, piercing spark of profound warmth bloomed deep beneath the scarred tissue. It felt exactly as though a single, glowing golden ember had been pressed gently against her freezing skin, instantly thawing the deep, numb void in her chest. The restorative heat spread rapidly down her collarbone, rushing fiercely into her freezing bloodstream. Alara drew a sharp, quiet breath, her pale lips parting slightly. The physical sensation was completely overwhelming, a massive sensory shock to a body that had expected only a slow, agonizing, freezing death. She quickly clamped her teeth together, her jaw tightening as she refused to show a visible, loose physical reaction to the watching court. She tasted a faint drop of copper as she bit the inside of her cheek, utilizing the sharp pain as a grounding mechanism. She held the Emperor's burning gaze for one impossible, eternal second. Then, with smooth, deliberate grace, she slowly lowered her eyes to the wet cobblestones, carefully assuming the submissive, invisible posture of a servant. She did not look down out of fear. She looked down out of strategic survival. Ignis felt the heavy impact of her gaze in the very center of his chest. It was a staggering physical blow. His inner dragon roared violently against the inside of his ribs. An instinctual, deafening demand to cross the courtyard, shatter the stone well into dust, and wrap the shivering, bloodied woman securely in his own heavy, fire-warmed cloak. The elemental pull was absolute, defying every established law of the wolf packs. It was the fated scent he had unknowingly sought across 3 distinct kingdoms. He took a slow, tremendously deep breath. The dark iron chains on his forearms clinked softly as he clenched his massive fists, his thick knuckles turning bone white. He was enforcing a brutal, agonizing self-restraint, reining in the sudden, destructive urge to massacre the entire Ironwood court for daring to force his true mate into that coarse grey dress. He would not frighten her. He would not be another aggressive monster in her tragic life. "Alpha Gavin," Ignis finally said. His voice was a low, volcanic rumble that powerfully vibrated through the very foundations of the ancient keep. "Your courtyard is cold." Gavin chuckled nervously, remaining blind to the lethal danger actively radiating from the Emperor's rigidly still posture. "The winter comes fast to the north, Emperor. The elements are naturally harsh, but the hearths inside the inner keep are roaring beautifully, and my new Luna has prepared a grand feast to celebrate the treaty signing." Gavin gestured proudly to Cynthia, pulling her slightly forward into the Emperor's line of sight. Ignis looked down at Cynthia. He looked with deep disdain at the stolen silver silks that clearly did not belong to her. He easily smelled the faint, lingering scent of Alara's profound sorrow, permanently clinging to the stolen fabric. Cynthia offered a deep, highly practiced curtsy, but the Emperor did not acknowledge it. He did not offer a single courteous word of blessing. "We shall see," Ignis murmured softly. His storm-grey eyes shifted rapidly back to the dark corner for a fraction of a second, intently watching as the woman in grey silently resumed, hauling the heavy iron bucket, her bleeding hands bravely gripping the frozen rope. "Lead the way." They left the biting wind behind, crossing the heavy iron-bound threshold of the inner doors. The thick walls muted the howling storm outside as the procession moved up the stone stairwell, entering the opulent heart of the stronghold. The council chamber of the inner keep was suffocatingly hot, a stark, brutal contrast to the freezing misery of the exterior grounds. The massive stone hearth blazed aggressively with a roaring fire, casting long, frantically dancing shadows across the heavy tapestries that proudly depicted the violent history of the Ironwood pack. Alara stepped quietly through the heavy oak doors, her slender arms trembling intensely under the immense weight of a massive silver serving tray. Cynthia had explicitly demanded that the disgraced servant personally bring the spiced wine to the high treaty negotiations. It was a calculated, vicious move designed to publicly display Elara's broken status before the visiting sovereign. She wore the scratchy woolen frock. Her thin, soaked leather boots left faint, wet marks on the opulent woven rugs. Every single step sent a sharp jolt of pain up her bruised spine, but she kept her chin perfectly level. The room was thick with the scent of roasted meats, heavy floral perfumes, and the sharp, metallic tension of high-stakes political maneuvering. At the head of the long oak table sat Gavin, looking every bit the proud, dominant alpha in his element. Cynthia was seated, pressed tightly against his side, elegantly draped in the stolen silver silks, her golden hair perfectly braided to showcase the fake lunar mark painted onto her skin. Opposite them sat Ignis Valerius. The southern monarch was unnervingly still. He did not casually lean back in his large wooden chair. He did not nervously fiddle with his crystal goblet. He sat with the terrifying, motionless patience of an apex predator, simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The burning gold treaty, a massive, ancient military alliance parchment explicitly meant to bind their forces, lay unrolled on the table between them, its thick edges glowing faintly with powerful, dormant magical seals. Elara approached the long table, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the empty crystal goblets. The ambient heat radiating from the Emperor was immense, a tangible physical aura that made the air shimmer with mirage-like waves. "Pour the wine, servant," Cynthia commanded, her voice dripping with cruel, unearned satisfaction. "And do not spill a single drop on the parchment. Your hands are filthy enough as it is." Elara did not react to the petty taunt. She stepped forward, lifting the heavy silver pitcher with immense physical effort. Her bruised, split knuckles were raw and bloody, a glaring, undeniable testament to the brutal manual labor she had endured. She poured Gavin's cup, the dark red wine splashing heavily against the fine crystal. She poured Cynthia's cup next. Then she stepped cautiously toward Ignis. As she neared the seated Emperor, a deliberate shift occurred in the atmosphere. The oppressive, suffocating heat radiating from his massive frame suddenly retracted. He was actively pulling his dangerous aura inward, tightly suppressing his own elemental fire to ensure he did not burn her delicate skin. It was an act of profound, instinctual physical respect. Elara leaned in closely to pour his goblet. Her battered hands were mere inches from his massive, battle-scarred fingers resting quietly on the oak table. Ignis looked down closely at her hands. He saw the torn flesh, the bursting blisters, the deep, agonizing cuts from the rough hemp ropes. A thick muscle feathered in his sharp jawline. The heavy dark iron chains tightly wrapped around his wrists let out a sharp, metallic clink as his massive hands twitched, actively fighting the overwhelming, primal urge to reach out and take her bleeding hands gently into his own. The mating mark on Elara's neck flared instantly. It did not bleed. It pulsed with a deep, comforting, protective warmth, singing in beautiful harmony with the Emperor's near proximity. The sensation was so intensely safe, so profoundly grounding, that Elara's breath hitched faintly in her throat. She finished pouring the wine, instantly stepping backward, and strategically retreating into the dark, quiet shadows of the chamber corner, standing absolutely motionless like a carved stone statue. Gavin enthusiastically raised his goblet, gesturing grandly toward the glowing parchment. "The ironwood pack is ready to secure the southern borders, Emperor. My armies are exceptionally strong. My territory is vast, and my Luna is incredibly fertile. We respectfully ask for the protection of your dragonfire in return. This treaty will bring unmatched prosperity to us both." Ignis paid no attention to the glowing treaty. He slowly picked up his crystal goblet, turning it deliberately in his massive hand, watching the red liquid swirl. "The laws of the Dragon Lords are profoundly ancient, Gavin Ironwood," Ignis stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that carried the crushing, undeniable weight of centuries. We absolutely do not sign permanent military alliances based on the mere untested word of a wolf. The Burning Gold Treaty firmly requires the signature of a true undisputed alpha and his fated Luna, a Luna who carries the true blessing of the earth. Gavin smiled smugly, wrapping a thick, possessive arm around Cynthia's delicate shoulders. As I have proudly proclaimed before my entire court, Cynthia Sterling carries the true blessing. She is the fertile, undisputed future of this pack. Ignis set the goblet down. He did not slam it, but the sheer, restrained force was enough to make the thick crystal crack slightly under the immense pressure of his fingers. "Is she?" Ignis asked, his voice deathly quiet. His storm-grey eyes locked intensely onto Cynthia, shifting instantly to a blinding, molten gold. Cynthia physically shrank back, deeply in her heavy wooden chair, her calculated smile collapsing into genuine terror. She felt the sudden, crushing weight of a sovereign who could easily see straight through her elaborate lies. "Because the air in this room smells heavily of forgery," Ignis continued, his gaze piercing her fragile facade. "It smells of a broken oath and stolen silver." Gavin bristled violently, his fragile pride stung, his alpha instincts flaring highly defensively. He slammed his broad hand onto the table. "Are you questioning my absolute mandate, Emperor? I rightfully stripped the barren curse from my side for the undeniable good of my people. The former Luna was a hollow, useless vessel. She brought no life. Her blood was stagnant. In the deep shadows, Elara's expression remained an impenetrable, flawless mask of stone. She absolutely refused to wince at the horrific public insult. She focused entirely on the steady, rhythmic pace of her own breathing." Ignis stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped backward across the stone floor, the terrible sound echoing loudly. His massive frame completely dominated the room, casting a long, dark shadow entirely over the glowing treaty. The fire in the great hearth flared in direct response to his rising anger, the flames instantly turning from a warm yellow to a blinding, ferocious white heat. "I reject this claim," Ignis declared. He did not speak as a polite diplomat. He spoke with the absolute, unquestionable authority of an emperor. The words struck the room exactly like a physical blow. "I do not recognize the woman sitting beside you in the silver silks as the Luna of this territory." Sheer panic flashed wildly in Gavin's amber eyes. The military alliance was crucial for his pack's survival against the rapidly encroaching winter hordes. "Emperor, the treaty. The treaty is nothing but stained parchment until the ancient sacred laws are fully satisfied," Ignis interrupted coldly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper that demanded total, immediate silence. He pointed a large, heavily scarred finger directly toward the center of the oak table. "You loudly claim the quiet woman in the shadows is a barren curse. You arrogantly claim the trembling woman sitting beside you is the fertile savior. Words are merely wind, Alpha. I demand absolute proof." "What proof?" Gavin demanded defensively, his voice trembling slightly, his loud bravado rapidly crumbling under the intense, crushing atmospheric pressure. "The trial of the spring," Ignis commanded. A collective, genuinely horrified gasp rippled rapidly through the few council members present in the chamber. Even Elara's remarkably steady heartbeat faltered, skipping a heavy, noticeable beat against her ribs. The ancient spring of truth. It was a terrifying, subterranean pool buried deep beneath the cold foundations of the outer courtyard. For countless centuries, it was a highly sacred site, widely said to react violently and instantly to the moral and spiritual purity of a Luna. It was elemental magic, pure and entirely unforgiving. "The spring has not been actively invoked in 300 years, Gavin shouted, cold sweat aggressively beading on his forehead as he realized he was rapidly losing control of his own room. "It is a dead relic, a myth from the old age. We govern strictly by the blood of the wolf now. It is the undeniable law of the Dragon Lords," Ignis replied, his harsh tone leaving zero room for political negotiation. He was a mountain of immovable, fiery stone. If you truly want my fire to protect your borders, your chosen Luna will walk directly into the black waters. If she carries the true blessing, the spring will undoubtedly answer her. If she is a fraud, the water will remain dead. Cynthia went deathly pale, her face matching the color of fresh snow. Her perfectly painted crimson lips trembled uncontrollably. She gripped the wooden arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She knew the terrifying truth. She possessed no ancient magic. She was a mere political maneuver, nothing more. And, Ignis added slowly, his molten gold gaze shifting past the terrified Alpha to the quiet, stoic woman standing alone in the shadows. His harsh, terrifying expression softened for the briefest fraction of a second, vividly revealing a profound, agonizing yearning. The woman you so carelessly discarded will walk the spring as well. Absolutely preposterous, Gavin roared loudly, standing up abruptly, his heavy chair toppling backward onto the floor. She is a disgraced, broken servant. She is wearing that cheap prisoner's sack. To deliberately put her in the sacred waters is a horrific desecration of our proud traditions. To deny her the trial is a public confession of your own cowardly lies. Ignis countered effortlessly, his deep voice echoing with undeniable finality. He slowly crossed his thick arms over his broad chest, the heavy dark iron chains clinking ominously in the tense silence. Those are my final terms, Gavin Ironwood. The trial of the spring at dusk. Let the ancient waters definitively decide who is the barren curse and who is the true queen. Until then, the Burning Gold Treaty remains unsigned. Ignis did not wait for a formal dismissal. He turned gracefully on his heel and strode purposefully toward the heavy oak doors. As he passed the dark, secluded corner where Alara quietly stood, he did not stop his stride. He did not turn his imposing head, but the oppressive heat radiating intensely from his massive body vanished. In its place, a gentle, impossible warmth washed over her, wrapping securely around her shivering shoulders exactly like a phantom fur cloak. He walked out of the silent chamber, the wooden doors shutting firmly behind him. He left the Alpha King staring down in sheer panic at his ruined diplomacy, and he left Alara utterly alone in the shadows, holding a sudden, dangerous spark of hope in the frozen dark. At dusk, the royal guards came to herd the court down below. Crossing the threshold from the warm inner keep to the cold, echoing stairwells felt like stepping into an open grave. The descent into the subterranean bowels of Ironwood Keep was a brutal, punishing march into forgotten history. The spiral stone staircase plunged deep beneath the frozen foundations of the outer courtyard, winding downward into the absolute, oppressive dark of the earth. With every descending step, the ambient temperature dropped. The sharp, biting chill of the winter winds above was replaced by a heavy, suffocating dampness that clung to the skin like a wet shroud. It was a cold that did not merely bite the surface, it seeped into the marrow. It carried the distinct, metallic tang of undisturbed limestone and the thick, earthy scent of rotting moss. The sounds of the living keep, the clashing of swords in the training yards, the howling of the guard dogs, the crackle of the great hearths, were swallowed by the immense, crushing silence of the stone. Alara Thorne walked downward in total silence. She wore the coarse, degrading grey linen dress forced upon her by the Alpha King. The thin, cheap fabric offered no defense against the plunging temperature, scratching against her bruised skin with every movement. Her bare, battered feet were shoved into soaked, unlined leather boots that slipped on the slick, algae-coated stone steps. Every deliberate shift in her weight pulled at the raw, bleeding blisters on her palms, sending sharp, electric jolts of sheer agony shooting up her forearms and settling deep into her exhausted shoulders. The severed mating mark on the delicate curve of her neck throbbed with a hollow, dead ache. It was a dark, freezing void, a phantom limb crying out for a warmth that had been surgically amputated by a cruel mandate. Yet she did not stumble. She did not pause to lean against the damp, freezing wall for support. She locked her knees. She kept her spine straight, her chin level and her storm-grey eyes fixed forward. She descended into the crushing dark, not as a broken, discarded servant, but as a silent, unyielding witness to the impending truth. The public stripping of her silks was supposed to break her. It was designed to shatter her spirit and force her to beg. But they did not understand the architecture of her survival. The narrow staircase opened into a vast natural amphitheatre of jagged black rock. This was the sacred cavern of the ancient spring of truth. The space was devoid of natural light. Hundreds of heavy rusted iron sconces lined the immense cavern walls, holding thick, pitch-soaked torches that burned with a low, sputtering orange flame. The flickering, unstable light cast monstrous shadows across the uneven ceiling, illuminating weathered carvings of the old gods. These were the elemental deities of earth, deep water, and subterranean fire that predated the arrival of the wolf packs by millennia. They were faceless, imposing monoliths of stone, watching the petty squabbles of mortals with cold indifference. At the very center of the immense cavern, dominating the space, lay the pool. It was perfectly round, carved directly into the unforgiving bedrock by countless centuries of slow, persistent dripping water. The surface of the spring was undisturbed, resembling a massive, flawless disk of polished obsidian. It was black, stagnant, and heavy like iron. It did not reflect the dancing orange torchlight. It seemed to absorb the illumination entirely, functioning as a bottomless, greedy void waiting patiently to judge the souls of those who dared to step within its boundaries. A prison cell was meant to erase a captive's existence, but the subterranean cavern served as an altar of judgment before the relentless memory of the earth. Brandon Cole stood quietly at the edge of the dark, freezing water. The venerable priest was a stark, jarring contrast to the heavily armored warriors of the High Court. He wore simple, unadorned, faded robes of forest green and deep brown, representing the traditional, sacred colors of the old earth worshippers. His face was a complex map of deeply etched wrinkles, his ancient eyes milky with age, but sharp with an unwavering, absolute faith. He held a heavy brass censer suspended by a thin, rattling iron chain, slowly and rhythmically swinging it back and forth over the still water. Thick, heavy plumes of grey smoke curled upward, filling the damp, stagnant air with the sharp, medicinal aroma of burning sage, crushed pine needles, and toxic dried wolfsbane. He was preparing the sacred trial under a suffocating, almost unbearable blanket of heavy political tension. The elite members of the Ironwood Pack had already assembled in full force. They stood crowded together on the natural stepped stone terraces overlooking the dark pool, their heavy, luxurious winter furs brushing against the damp, weeping cavern walls. Hundreds of predatory, observant eyes glowed faintly amber and yellow in the dim torchlight, shifting restlessly in the gloom. The ambient noise of the massive crowd was a low, anxious hum, a collective, physical vibration of deep unease. They were creatures of raw blood, sharp teeth and cracking bone. They relied on undeniable physical strength and the dominant, violent mandates of their reigning alpha. To be dragged down deep into the blind earth to face an elemental, magical judgment they could not physically fight, bite, or intimidate was fundamentally unsettling to their primal instincts. Gavin Ironwood paced near the jagged edge of the lowest stone tier. The Alpha King radiated a volatile defensive energy. His heavy, steel-toed boots crunched loudly against the loose, wet gravel, the harsh sound echoing sharply against the cavern walls. He wore his thickest, most majestic direwolf pelt, his broad chest puffed out to its absolute limit in a calculated attempt to project unquestionable authority. But his internal panic was a palpable, foul scent, bleeding into the damp air. His amber eyes darted nervously between the stagnant black water and the high, shadowed archways. He had built his entire reign on the sheer strength of his armies, the sharpness of his political betrayals, and the ruthlessness of his ambition. He did not understand the old magic. He actively, deeply despised it. It was uncontrollable, it was silent. But the vital military alliance with the Southern Empire required this archaic, frustrating validation. The sovereign of ash and flame had demanded it. The crucial diplomatic pact hung in the balance. He had to prove his chosen Luna was fertile. He had to prove he had not made a catastrophic, kingdom-ending mistake. "Are the preparations finally complete, priest?" Gavin demanded. His booming voice echoed across the black water, bouncing off the jagged rocks and distorting into a harsh, hollow bark. He desperately wanted to rush the process. He needed to control the fragile narrative before the crushing silence of the ancient cave eroded his pack's wavering confidence any further. Brandon Cole did not flinch at the Alpha's commanding tone. He did not bow. He slowly lowered the heavy brass censer, letting the iron chain clink softly against the wet stone floor. He turned his ancient milky eyes toward the pacing king. "The old magic does not operate on the frantic schedule of mortal kings, Gavin Ironwood," the priest replied calmly. His reedy, thin voice carried effortlessly over the low, anxious murmurs of the crowded terraces. He deliberately did not use the Alpha's royal title. Here, deep in the roots of the earth, the iron crowns of men meant nothing. The water is awake. It listens to the blood. It does not fear a wolf's teeth, and it cannot be coerced by a loud royal decree. It answers only to the undeniable truth of the sacred. Gavin's strong jaw clenched tightly. A thick, prominent muscle feathered in his pale cheek as he ground his teeth together. "Then let us proceed immediately and be done with this ridiculous myth. I have already formally declared the absolute truth to my people. My chosen mate carries the heavy blessing of life. We are only here to satisfy a stubborn diplomatic formality imposed by our guests." Elara stood isolated in the deepest, coldest shadows near the cavern entrance. She was ignored by the murmuring elites, deliberately shunned, as if her coarse grey dress carried a lethal physical contagion. The freezing dampness of the stone seeped through her thin soles, numbing her bruised toes and travelling painfully up her aching calves. She crossed her slender arms loosely in front of her waist, carefully hiding her bleeding, blister-stained hands within the rough folds of the cheap fabric. Her inner wolf remained tightly, defensively coiled, a silent, unmoving ball of strict preservation conserving every microscopic ounce of core heat. She refused to glance at Gavin. She ignored the restless, whispering crowd. She focused entirely on the undisturbed surface of the black pool. She watched a single, heavy drop of freezing condensation gather on a jagged stalactite high above. It hung there for a long moment, trembling, before falling directly into the obsidian water. It struck the surface with a tiny, sharp, echoing plink. The small ripple it caused was sluggish, thick, and instantly swallowed by the dominating stillness of the spring. The water was waiting. It was a patient, ancient judge. "We are small things in a world of teeth," her mother had once whispered to her. But the earth has no teeth. It only has truth. Gavin turned sharply toward the main archway, sweeping his heavy arm out in a grand, theatrical gesture. "Cynthia Sterling, step forward and claim your rightful, undeniable place before the earth and the pack." The crowd parted instantly, shuffling backward. Cynthia walked gracefully down the steep, uneven stone path, stepping over the jagged rocks. She was draped entirely in the stolen, expensive silver Luna silks. The delicate, shimmering, almost translucent fabric caught the orange torchlight, making her look precisely like a glowing beacon of wealth, privilege, and high status. Her golden hair was flawlessly braided, tightly interwoven, with small gleaming pearls and fine silver threads. She was a stunning vision of high-born perfection. Beautiful the way a poisoned blade was beautiful, and wholly out of place in the brutal, dirty, unforgiving reality of the subterranean cave. She offered a slow, calculated, sweet smile to the assembled crowd. It was a practiced smile designed to project confidence, gentle warmth, and fertile grace. As she passed the dark, secluded corner where Elara stood, Cynthia purposely slowed her measured pace. She turned her head slightly and shot a condescending, pitying glance directly at the disgraced servant shivering in the coarse grey garment. She desperately wanted Elara to see her impending, glorious victory. She wanted the former, broken queen to watch helplessly as the very earth seemingly validated her cruel usurpation. Elara met the smug, arrogant gaze with a wall of impenetrable, storm-grey silence. She did not sneer in disgust. She did not look away in shame. She simply blinked slowly, her expression a flawless carved mask of cold stone. The absolute, terrifying lack of an emotional reaction caused a brief, microscopic falter in Cynthia's confident stride. A cold seed of sudden doubt planted itself in the impostor's chest, but she quickly forced her sweet smile back into place and kept walking. Cynthia reached the edge of the freezing pool. She stood closely beside Gavin, placing her small, perfectly manicured hand lightly and possessively on his thick, muscular forearm. He offered her a stiff, reassuring nod, though his intense amber eyes remained tight with lingering, unshakable anxiety. Brandon Cole approached her. He carried a small, carved wooden bowl that had been smoothed by centuries of sacred use. He dipped the bowl deep into the black spring, drawing up a full measure of the freezing, stagnant water. He stepped forward with a slow, measured gait and knelt heavily at Cynthia's feet. The ancient earth demands absolute humility. The venerable priest intoned softly, his voice echoing eerily. Remove your fine slippers. Bare your naked skin to the undeniable truth. Cynthia hesitated visibly. The damp, uneven stone floor was freezing, slick with condensation and ancient moss. She looked up quickly at Gavin, her eyes silently, desperately asking for a royal exemption from the harsh, degrading ritual. But the Alpha King gave a curt, tight, unforgiving shake of his massive head. The entire critical court was watching. The silent, terrifying shadow of Ignis Valerius loomed heavily on the high balcony, observing the proceedings with lethal patience. There could be no shortcuts. There could be no weakness displayed. Reluctantly, her jaw tight with hidden annoyance, Cynthia slipped her delicate feet out of her warm, fur-lined slippers. She stood barefoot on the freezing, biting black rock, her delicate, pale toes immediately curled tightly against the vicious, shocking cold. Brandon Cole deliberately poured the entire bowl of black, freezing water directly over her bare feet. Cynthia gasped sharply, sucking in a loud, painful breath. Her slender shoulders jerked upward. The sheer physical shock of the freezing water was immediate and agonizing. It shattered her graceful, carefully composed posture. The dark water felt exactly like liquid ice, slicing into her soft, pampered skin and sending sharp cramps shooting up her delicate calves. She bit her perfectly painted crimson lip hard to stop her jaw from trembling, forcing her ragged breathing to remain steady under the scrutiny of the pack. "Enter the spring," the priest commanded, stepping backward and gesturing with a sweeping motion toward the dark, undisturbed surface of the pool. "Walk slowly until the water embraces your waist. If you truly carry the blessing of life, the ancient magic will recognize your blood. The deep darkness will recede. The water will sing with heat. Do not fear the cold if your heart is pure." Cynthia swallowed hard. The terror was visible in the rapid, frantic pulse beating against the delicate, pale skin of her throat. She knew the devastating, dangerous truth. She possessed no ancient magic. Her entire elevation was a carefully orchestrated, political maneuver, built on Gavin's arrogance and her own calculated, whispered lies in the dark. She had no divine connection to the earth. She was merely an ambitious woman wearing stolen clothes, but she had no choice. To refuse to enter the water now was a public confession of high treason. She took a slow, trembling step forward. Her bare foot breached the smooth surface of the obsidian pool. The water swallowed her ankle. It was heavy, thick, and unimaginably cold. Cynthia let out a small, pathetic whimper of genuine physical pain, regretting the weak sound as it echoed clearly across the silent cavern. She forced herself to take another agonizing step. The black water rose steadily to her pale knees. The delicate, expensive silver silk of her stolen dress absorbed the stagnant, freezing moisture. The shimmering, beautiful fabric darkened to a dull, depressing grey, clinging heavily to her shivering legs. The immense weight of the wet silk dragged at her, pulling her down exactly like physical chains. She stumbled slightly, her arms flailing in the air for balance, her elegant pearl-woven braids swinging against her cheeks. She waded deeper, pushing against the crushing resistance of the stagnant pool. The freezing water reached her trembling thighs, and finally her waist. She stopped. She stood perfectly still in the exact center of the dark pool. She closed her eyes, crossing her arms tightly over her heaving chest, shivering uncontrollably. She waited desperately for the miraculous, promised warmth. She waited for the brilliant golden light she had heard about in the old nursery rhymes. She prayed silently to any god that would listen for just a tiny spark of magic to save her life and her stolen crown. The entire cavern held its collective, anxious breath. Hundreds of elite wolves stared intently at the dark water. The silence was absolute, heavy, and physically crushing. Seconds ticked by with brutal slowness. The only sound in the vast space was the slow, steady dripping of condensation from the high ceiling and the rapid, desperate gasping of Cynthia's panicked breath. A full, terrifying minute passed. Then, too, nothing happened. The water remained perfectly black. It was stagnant. It was dead. It did not hum with any ancient resonance. It did not warm her freezing, blue-tinted skin. It did not crown her in holy, glowing light. It merely sat there, a dark, apathetic void, absorbing her precious body heat and offering nothing in return. Cynthia's teeth began to chatter loudly. The sharp, rhythmic clicking sound echoed humiliatingly off the jagged, unfeeling stone walls. Her golden hair lost its vibrant luster in the damp, foul air, hanging in limp, pathetic, wet strands around her pale, terrified face. Her perfect crimson lips turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple. She opened her eyes, staring down wildly at the dark water, pure panic flaring in her gaze. It's too cold, she stammered, her voice cracking painfully into a high-pitched, undignified whine. She looked pleadingly toward the rocky shore, her eyes finding the alpha. Gavin, please, it's freezing me. I can't feel my legs. Gavin Ironwood stepped forward, his heavy boots splashing recklessly into the shallow edge of the pool. His handsome face was contorted in a horrifying mixture of desperate denial and rapidly rising terror. The absolute certainty of his powerful alpha mandate was publicly, catastrophically fracturing right before his very eyes. "Give it time," Gavin shouted, his voice echoing frantically across the cavern. He glared fiercely at the priest. "The magic is old. It has been dormant for centuries. It needs significantly more time to recognize the true Luna, or perhaps it is protecting the child. Yes, the water is remaining calm and cold to shield her womb from the shock." Brandon Cole slowly, deliberately shook his ancient head. His milky eyes were filled with a profound, immovable disappointment. He looked pityingly at the shivering, broken woman in the water, and then with deep disgust at the desperate king. "The ancient magic does not sleep, Alpha," the venerable priest declared. His reedy voice cut cleanly through Gavin's pathetic excuses with the sharp edge of absolute truth. "It does not need extra time to recognize a sacred vessel. It reacts instantly and undeniably to the pure pulse of the earth. It simply does not recognize her. She is empty." A collective murmur of profound shock, deep anger, and extreme doubt rippled through the tense pack. The elite warriors exchanged nervous, suspicious glances. The whispered conversations grew rapidly louder, filling the cavern with the sound of snapping loyalty. The pack had been promised a divine, fertile savior who would guarantee their survival. Instead, they were watching a shivering, ordinary, lying woman failing a sacred trial in front of the entire court. "The spring is dead to her touch," Brandon Cole finalized, his harsh verdict echoing with unshakable finality. "She carries no blessing. She is not the Luna of this earth." "Lies," Gavin roared furiously, his large hand instinctively dropping to grip the heavy iron hilt of his broadsword. His internal wolf was snarling, trapped in a public corner of its own making. He was entirely ready to execute the old priest for daring to speak the truth. "You rigged the water, you treacherous old man. You harbor secret loyalty to the disgraced, barren servant." "The water answers only to the truth of the gods," the priest replied calmly, completely unafraid of the Alpha's physical threat. He stood his ground like an ancient, deeply rooted tree. "Pull your shivering woman from the spring before the frostbite permanently claims her legs." Gavin Ironwood. Cynthia did not wait for Gavin's permission or assistance. Sheer humiliation overrode her desperate desire to forcefully maintain her royal facade. She scrambled frantically toward the rocky shore. She was no longer a picture of high-born, untouchable grace. She was a wet, shivering, terrified imposter dragging a massive, ruined weight of dirty, greying silk behind her. She clawed her way out of the black pool, her bare, freezing hands scraping painfully against the jagged, unforgiving stones. She collapsed heavily onto the freezing terrace, leaving wet, muddy footprints and a pathetic trail of stagnant, black water across the sacred floor. Her chest heaved with violent, uncontrollable sobs of sheer physical misery and total public ruin. Gavin rushed to her side. He tore the heavy, luxurious direwolf fur from his own broad shoulders and threw it hastily over her shaking, pathetic form. But his face was a terrifying, volatile mask of pure fury and deep, agonizing public humiliation. He glared at the loudly murmuring crowd, baring his elongated canines in a silent, desperate threat, daring anyone to openly challenge his crumbling authority. In the deep, freezing shadows of the cavern entrance, Elara Thorne watched the spectacular unraveling of the massive lie. She did not smile. She did not allow a single, tiny flicker of vindicated satisfaction to cross her stoic, pale features. She did not gloat over the pathetic, sobbing form of the woman who had stolen her crown, her warm bed, and her public dignity. She merely stood with her bruised hands quietly folded, her spine perfectly straight, functioning as an immovable, silent fortress of quiet endurance. The coarse fabric of the grey linen dress scratched brutally against her raw skin, and the freezing air bit into her exposed neck, but internally she was a towering mountain of impenetrable iron. For a long moment the only sound was the low, sputtering crackle of the pitch torches, and the agonizing drip of the disturbed water against the wet stone. The heavy, crushing tension in the subterranean cavern did not dissipate with Cynthia's humiliating failure. It shifted, turning rapidly like a massive, invisible tide. The angry whispers of the pack slowly died down, replaced by a tense, breathless anticipation. Hundreds of glowing amber eyes slowly, simultaneously turned away from the furious, pacing Alpha and the sobbing imposter on the floor. They turned toward the dark, isolated corner. They turned directly toward the disgraced, broken, silent servant, standing quietly in the shadows. It was her turn. Elara moved. The simple, deliberate action broke the suffocating paralysis of the cavern. She stepped forward, leaving the deep, freezing shadows of the entrance and walking directly into the flickering, unstable, orange light of the torches. The coarse fabric of the plain uniform offered zero majestic flair. It hung limply on her half-starved frame, a stark, depressing canvas of grey against the jagged black rock. Yet she carried herself with the undeniable, towering grace of a monarch ascending a grand staircase. The silence in the subterranean amphitheatre became absolute. The collective breathing of hundreds of elite wolves seemed to cease entirely. They watched her with a mixture of deep suspicion, lingering contempt, and a sudden, inexplicable dread. They were waiting for her to shatter. They were waiting for the final undeniable proof that Gavin Ironwood was right, that this quiet, stoic woman was nothing more than a hollow, useless vessel carrying a barren curse. She did not look at the crowded Tekrises. She did not look at the Alpha King, who stood rigidly near the shore, with his jaw clenched in defensive fury. She completely ignored Cynthia Sterling, who was currently curled into a pathetic, shivering ball of wet silk and stolen fur on the cold stone. Ilara's storm-grey eyes were locked entirely on the undisturbed, obsidian surface of the ancient spring of truth. Her bare, battered feet moved carefully over the treacherous, algae-coated rocks. She did not wear warm, fur-lined slippers like the false Luna. Her soles were heavily bruised, her toes blue, from the relentless exposure to the freezing mud of the exterior bailey. The sharp edges of the limestone bit into her raw skin, threatening to slice her open with every measured step. But she resolutely refused to wince. She was a silent, unyielding witness to her own impending judgment. The lowest holding cells existed to bury unwanted souls, but the dark water was a realm to be remembered. Brandon Cole watched her approach. The venerable priest's milky eyes widened a fraction of a millimeter. He saw the deep, agonizing physical deterioration of her body, the hollow cheekbones, the split, bleeding knuckles, the pale, almost translucent quality of her freezing skin. But beneath the severe physical trauma, he sensed an immense, coiled pressure. He sensed a profound, sleeping resonance that made the heavy brass censer in his ancient hand vibrate faintly. Ilara stopped at the absolute edge of the black pool. The priest did not need to instruct her to bare her skin. She was already stripped of every worldly defense. He slowly dipped the carved wooden bowl into the stagnant freezing water. He lifted it, his ancient hands trembling slightly under the crushing weight of the impending magic. He knelt before the disgraced servant. "The earth asks for nothing but the truth. Ilara Thorne," the priest whispered, his reedy voice barely carrying over the faint, rhythmic dripping of the cavern. He tipped the bowl. The black, freezing water spilled violently over her raw, bruised and bloody feet. The physical shock was catastrophic. The water was fundamentally liquid ice, carrying the dead, suffocating chill of 1,000 untouched winters. It instantly sliced through her numbed nerves, sending a blinding, jagged spike of sheer agony rocketing up her calves and directly into her spine. Ilara's breath hitched sharply, a tiny involuntary gasp escaping her pale, chapped lips. Her inner wolf, previously curled into a tight, defensive ball of preservation, whimpered loudly in the dark corners of her mind, terrified by the sudden, overwhelming assault of the elemental cold. But she did not break her posture. She did not violently jerk her shoulders or cross her arms to hoard her precious body heat. She dug her fingernails ruthlessly into the raw, bursting blisters of her palms, utilizing the sharp, localized pain to ground her rapidly fraying consciousness. "Enter the spring," the priest commanded, stepping backward, his milky eyes locked intensely on her stoic face. Ilara took a breath. The damp, foul air filled her aching lungs. She lifted her right foot and stepped directly into the obsidian void. The black water swallowed her ankle. It was heavy, pulling at her like wet, freezing mud. She took another step, dragging her left foot into the pool. The excruciating cold instantly sank its teeth into her calves, numbing her muscles and aggressively threatening to stop the sluggish circulation of her blood. The coarse fabric of the dress absorbed the stagnant water, the hem growing instantly heavy and stiff, acting as a weighted anchor, trying desperately to drag her down into the crushing dark. Pace by pace, she waded deeper. The jagged, uneven floor of the spring threatened her balance, but she maintained her flawless, unbent spine. She walked until the freezing, apathetic water reached her trembling thighs, and finally her slender waist. She stopped in the exact center of the pool, occupying the precise spot where the imposter had stood and failed. The cold was absolute. It was a vicious, predatory entity actively devouring her last, microscopic reserves of core heat. The severed mating mark on her neck throbbed with a hollow, frantic agony, screaming for a protective warmth that simply did not exist. Ilara closed her eyes. She did not pray to the old gods for a miraculous rescue. She did not beg the water for mercy. She simply stood there, a towering mountain of impenetrable iron, fully prepared to freeze to death with her dignity intact. I accept, she thought silently to the darkness. I accept the cold. For 3 long, agonizing heartbeats, the cavern was completely dead. The water remained black. The crowd held its breath, ready to exhale in collective, mocking relief. The Alpha's tense, panicked shoulders finally began to lower. He prepared to open his mouth, to loudly declare his ultimate vindication before the silent Emperor on the balcony. But then, the bedrock beneath Ilara's bare feet began to hum. It was not a sound. It was a profound, deep earth vibration that bypassed the eardrums entirely and resonated directly within the skeletal structure. The low, rhythmic pulsing traveled rapidly up through the soles of her feet, vibrating intensely through her freezing shin bones and settling heavily in the very center of her chest. The severed, agonizing void on her neck violently reacted. The black ice that had encased her mating mark suddenly cracked. A massive, overwhelming spark of pure, unadulterated heat ignited deep within the scarred tissue. It did not burn with the painful, destructive heat of a forced mandate. It bloomed with the deep, fiercely protective, intensely safe warmth of a golden hearth fire. The sensation was so foreign, so profoundly comforting, that her tempest-hued gaze snapped open in sheer shock. The black water surrounding her waist was actively changing. It began as a faint, microscopic thread of glowing, luminescent gold, swirling gently through the stagnant ink. Then, another thread appeared, and another. The deep, ancient magic of the subterranean pool was frantically awakening, aggressively responding to the pure, undeniable bloodline standing within its depths. The temperature of the water skyrocketed. The vicious, biting cold that was actively killing her suddenly vanished, instantly replaced by a soothing, deeply therapeutic, immense warmth. It felt exactly like sinking into a massive pool of sun-baked honey. The therapeutic heat rushed violently into her freezing muscles, instantly thawing the ice in her veins, relaxing her brutally cramped calves and flooding her starved body with a wave of pure, restorative energy. The entire surface of the massive pool violently erupted into blinding, liquid gold. The transformation was instantaneous and physically staggering. The heavy, apathetic obsidian void was completely eradicated, replaced by a glowing, swirling, radiant vortex of molten light. The golden water illuminated the entire cavern, casting a brilliant, divine radiance that completely overpowered the sputtering orange flames of the iron torches. The jagged stalactites above sparkled like diamonds in the sudden, holy illumination. The water did not just glow, it actively moved. Gentle, warm currents of liquid gold swirled affectionately around her waist, caressing her raw, freezing skin through the cheap fabric. As the golden light touched the grey garment, the coarse, degrading fibers seemed to magically soften, losing their dull, depressing hue and taking on a brilliant, ethereal shimmer. The warmth spiraled upward, carrying the liquid gold with it in a mesmerizing dance. Droplet by weightless droplet, the glowing water defied the fundamental laws of gravity, ascending slowly from the radiant surface in a sparkling, levitating stream. The liquid light floated upward in a slow, swirling embrace through the damp air. It drifted with deliberate, sacred grace, slowly circling Elara's frozen features, allowing every eye in the cavern to trace the ascent of each golden bead before gently settling onto her dark hair. The droplets did not freeze. They rested perfectly upon her head, explicitly forming a brilliant, undeniable, glowing crown of crystallized dragonfire. A collective, deafening gasp of absolute, primal terror and profound awe ripped through the crowded terraces. Hundreds of elite wolves stumbled backward violently, throwing their arms up to shield their sensitive eyes from the blinding divine radiance. The ancient gods of the earth had not just answered, they were screaming their absolute truth. She was not a barren curse. She was not a hollow, useless vessel. The ancient earth recognized the deep, dormant magic in her blood. She carried the heavy, sacred lineage of the dragon mothers, an ancestry far older, far more powerful, and infinitely more pure than any wolf pack that currently walked the frozen north. Brandon Cole fell heavily to his knees on the jagged rocks, entirely ignoring the sharp pain in his ancient joints. Tears of pure, religious ecstasy streamed freely down his deeply wrinkled face. He pressed his forehead directly against the wet, cold stone, offering his absolute, unconditional submission to the divine truth. "The earth has spoken," the venerable priest cried out, his reedy voice suddenly possessing the booming, undeniable thunder of a zealot. "The true Luna is crowned in the light of the old gods. The barren curse is a lie." On the lowest stone tier, Gavin's entire reality violently shattered. The Alpha King staggered backward, his heavy steel-toed boots slipping wildly on the wet gravel. His handsome face was a terrifying, twisted mask of pure, absolute horror and mind-bending denial. The blinding golden light reflected brightly in his wide, panicked amber eyes, exposing the catastrophic, kingdom-ending magnitude of his arrogant mistake. He had thrown away a sacred, divine vessel to elevate a shivering, empty fraud. He had publicly mocked and tortured the very woman who held the favor of the earth. "No," Gavin whispered, his booming voice reduced to a pathetic, breathy rattle. "No, it is a trick, it is a foul, dark illusion," but his desperate, pathetic denial was instantly swallowed by a sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure. The deep, humming vibration of the golden spring was suddenly overpowered by a massive, crushing, suffocating wave of imperial heat. The shadows on the high balcony did not just part, they were violently incinerated. Ignis Valerius descended the steep, jagged stone steps of the subterranean cavern, not with the frantic, scrambling panic of the wolf elites, but with the slow, terrifying, inevitable measured pace of a walking apocalypse. The Fire Dragon Emperor did not require a torch. His massive, muscular frame actively radiated an immense, shimmering aura of volatile heat that visibly warped the damp air around him. The dark iron chains wrapped heavily around his thick forearms clinked ominously with every deliberate, ground-shaking stride. His storm-glass grey eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a blinding, predatory molten gold that perfectly mirrored the divine light of the awakened spring. The terrified pack parted before him like the sea before a storm. The elite warriors, heavily armed and supposedly fearless, instinctively averted their gazes and pressed their spines painfully against the freezing cavern walls, desperate to escape the crushing gravity of the Emperor's lethal presence. They smelled the sharp, unmistakable scent of burning cedar, melting iron, and pure, unrestrained wrath. To catch his eye was a death sentence the legends warned. But watching him now, the pack realized the terrifying truth. No kingdom would survive him if he was denied what he sought. Ignis reached the rocky shore of the Golden Pool. He did not look at the groveling priest. He completely ignored the pathetic, sobbing form of Cynthia. He stopped directly in front of the hyperventilating Alpha King. In his large, battle-scarred right hand, the Emperor held the Sacred Alliance document. The burning gold treaty, bound in thick dragon leather and glowing with dormant magical seals, represented the entire geopolitical survival of the Ironwood Pack against the incoming winter hordes. Gavin stared at the treaty, his chest heaving violently, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope attempting to claw its way through his total panic. "Emperor," Gavin choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "The trial is complete. You have your proof. The magic is satisfied. We can sign the alliance. I will restore her title. I will take her back. We will forge the pact." Ignis looked down at the Alpha. The expression on his harsh, angular face was completely devoid of mercy, political calculation, or diplomatic grace. It was a mask of cold, absolute disgust. "You do not command the terms of this earth, Gavin Ironwood," Ignis rumbled, his voice a low, volcanic tremor that shook dust from the high ceiling. "And you absolutely do not have the right to take back a sacred thing you so carelessly threw into the dirt." He raised his hand. He did not summon a massive fireball. He did not chant an ancient spell. He simply willed his internal temperature to briefly slip past the heavy iron restraints. The enchanted parchment instantly caught fire. It did not burn slowly. It violently erupted into a blinding column of white-hot, smokeless flame. The ancient magical seals on the parchment shrieked like dying animals as the imperial fire rapidly consumed them. Within 3 seconds, the massive, priceless document was completely reduced to a handful of fine, grey ash. Ignis slowly opened his thick fingers, letting the dead ashes drift gently to the wet stone floor, forever burying the alliance between their kingdoms. "The treaty is broken," Ignis declared, his voice ringing with absolute, devastating finality. "The Dragon Lords do not ally with blind, arrogant fools who deliberately torture their fated equals." "You cannot do this," Gavin roared, his immense terror finally giving way to a frantic, suicidal burst of alpha aggression. He lunged forward, his hand desperately grasping the heavy iron hilt of his broadsword, ready to defend his crumbling pride. "She is my marked Luna. She belongs to the Ironwood Pack." "You are a guest in my territory." Ignis did not draw a weapon. He simply turned his massive head and unleashed a microscopic fraction of his dominant aura directly onto the charging man. A localized, crushing wave of physical heat and absolute, predatory pressure slammed into Gavin like a charging rhinoceros. The Alpha was thrown violently backward, his boots entirely leaving the ground. He crashed heavily onto his back against the jagged stones, his broad sword clattering uselessly away into the dark. He gasped desperately for air, his hands clawing wildly at his own throat, as the overwhelming atmospheric pressure physically prevented his lungs from expanding. He was instantly pinned to the floor by the sheer, invisible weight of a superior sovereign. A profound, lingering silence smothered the dark cavern, broken only by the low, spitting crackle of the pitch torches lining the wet stone walls. The court held its collective breath. Ignis did not spare the choking king another glance. He turned away, entirely dismissing the threat, and stepped directly into the ancient spring of truth. The heavy steel-toed boots of the Emperor broke the surface of the glowing, golden water. Unlike the freezing, apathetic void that had ruthlessly assaulted the false Luna earlier, the divine spring instantly welcomed the fire. The warm, liquid gold swirled affectionately around his calves, humming in perfect, harmonious resonance with the deep, rumbling purr of his internal dragon. He waded slowly toward the exact center of the pool, moving with an agonizing, deliberate patience. He was actively enforcing a brutal, psychological self-restraint, desperately reining in his massive physical power to ensure he did not frighten the woman standing in the light. The heavy dark iron chains clinked softly against his armor, a highly public declaration that his terrifying instincts were strictly under his own control. Ilara remained perfectly still. The crown of floating, crystallized dragon fire illuminated her pale, hollow face highlighting the deep purple bruises under her eyes and the sharp, starving cut of her cheekbones. She watched the Emperor approach. Her storm-grey eyes were incredibly wide, mesmerized by the intense, protective heat actively radiating from his massive body. The severed mating mark on her neck was no longer a freezing void. It was singing, pulling her forcefully toward the absolute safety of his gravity. Ignis stopped mere inches from her. The height difference was staggering. His broad, armored chest eclipsed her slender, trembling form. He looked down into her eyes, his molten gold gaze stripping away the coarse grey fabric, the dirt and the blood, seeing only the flawless ancient queen beneath. Slowly, deliberately, the fire dragon emperor lowered himself. The water splashed softly as Ignis dropped heavily onto his right knee. The liquid gold rose to his armored chest, soaking his fine leathers. It was an act of unquestionable public submission. The most feared, destructive warlord in the southern hemisphere, a man who had burned entire kingdoms to ash, was voluntarily kneeling in the water before a disgraced starved servant. A profound, stunned silence fell over the cavern. Even the Alpha, still choking on the floor, stopped his frantic struggling, his amber eyes wide with sheer, incomprehensible shock. "Elara," Ignis whispered. His deep, gravelly voice was incredibly soft, carrying a profound, agonizing yearning that betrayed the terrifying harshness of his reputation. It was the very first time anyone had spoken her name with absolute reverence in 3 years. He reached out with his massive, battle-scarred hands. He did not grab her forcefully. He held his palms open, hovering just inches from her bruised, trembling fingers, offering her the absolute choice to close the distance. Elara looked down at the kneeling giant. The impenetrable iron fortress she had built around her heart over the last 3 days of freezing torture finally fractured. She slowly lifted her hands, her raw, blistered skin trembling violently, and placed her small, bleeding palms directly into his calloused hands. The moment they touched, a brilliant, blinding shockwave of pure thermal energy exploded from the center of the pool. The golden water violently surged outward, washing over the stone terraces in a warm, healing wave. The liquid gold did not merely splash. It began to defy gravity. Glowing, warm droplets slowly drifted upward from her waist like weightless embers, painting her bruised skin in a creeping, liquid warmth, before settling gently into the radiant crown upon her head. The physical contact was flawless perfection. The intense, fiery heat of his skin instantly seeped into her deeply frozen bones, obliterating the lingering, hollow ache of the cruel rejection. It was the profound, sensory relief of a safe hearth after a lifetime trapped in a winter storm. Ignis closed his thick fingers gently around hers, his heavy iron chains brushing against her wrists. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead directly against her bruised knuckles in a gesture of profound worship. "I reject the false authority of the wolf," the Emperor declared, his voice rising, carrying the crushing weight of imperial law across the echoing cavern. "I claim the ancient truth of the earth. You are not a servant. You are not discarded." He stood up gracefully, pulling her gently toward his massive armored chest. The intense heat radiating from him acted exactly like a physical shield, wrapping around her shivering form. He reached up and unclasped his heavy mantle. With immense care, he draped the luxurious dark fur cloak over Elara, completely covering the degrading wet fabric. "You are Elara Valerius," he announced to the terrified kneeling pack, his golden eyes flashing with a promise of lethal retribution against anyone who dared to challenge his claim. "And you are the Empress of the Southern Fires." The weight of the heavy fur cloak was a profound sensory anchor. It smelled powerfully of wood smoke, old leather, and his distinct, intoxicating fated scent. Elara pulled the thick edges of the fur tightly around her frame, burying her freezing nose into the soft collar. The physical warmth was an overwhelming, deeply therapeutic sanctuary. Her inner wolf, which had spent days curled in a silent, agonizing coma, suddenly stood up in her mind, shaking off the frost and letting out a long, harmonious howl of absolute belonging. She never glanced back at the rocky shore. She spared no attention for the imposter, who was now weeping hysterically, frantically trying to scrub the stagnant black mud from her stolen silks. She did not look at Gavin, who was finally managing to push himself onto his hands and knees, staring at the ashes of his ruined treaty and the catastrophic destruction of his entire political future. The Alpha King had foolishly chosen a hollow mistress over a sacred queen, and the unforgiving earth had aggressively balanced the scales. Elara looked only at the Emperor, the man who wore chains to prove his restraint, the man who burned treaties to protect her name. "Take me away from the cold," she whispered, her voice rough, exhausted, but perfectly steady. Ignis looked down at her, his harsh, terrifying features softening into an expression of terrifying devotion. The golden light of the ancient spring reflected brightly in his eyes, promising a future built not on freezing endurance, but on the enduring heat of a shared hearth. "Always my Empress," he murmured. He did not ask her to walk the jagged stones again. He simply leaned down, sliding one massive arm gently behind her knees and the other securely around her back, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. The disgraced servant, the barren curse, the woman who was forced to haul black water in the freezing wind, was carried out of the subterranean darkness bathed in liquid gold, leaving her abusers kneeling in the permanent ruin of their own making. The physical departure from the freezing north was not marked by a chaotic, frantic flight. It was a slow, deliberate extraction orchestrated by an emperor who possessed infinite, lethal patience. Ignis Valerius did not force Elara Thorn onto the high, intimidating saddle of his obsidian warhorse. Instead, a massive imperial carriage, lined heavily with glowing hearthstones and thick plush southern pelts, carried her away from the bitter, biting winds of the ironwood forests. For the first 4 days of the journey, she simply slept. Her exhausted, starved body sank into a profound, healing coma, anchored entirely by the luxurious dark fur cloak the sovereign had wrapped around her shoulders. When the disgraced servant finally opened her striking grey eyes, the oppressive, suffocating grey skies of the north were gone. They had crossed the border into the empire of the draconic warlord. The physical transition in the environment was staggering. The air entering the carriage window was not a jagged, freezing blade. It was a thick, fragrant breeze carrying the intoxicating aromas of wild, blooming jasmine, roasted cinnamon, and deep volcanic earth. The landscape outside was a vibrant, impossible painting of lush, emerald valleys and towering, dark mountain peaks crowned with glowing, molten vents. The imperial stronghold was a masterpiece of elemental architecture. It was not a cold, damp, defensive fortress like the keep she had left behind. The massive castle was carved directly into the heart of a dormant volcano, built from smooth, dark obsidian and veined heavily with rivers of glowing, liquid gold. The entire structure actively pulsed with a deep, rhythmic, subterranean heartbeat that resonated perfectly with the newly awakened magic singing in the young woman's veins. Ignis brought Elara directly to the royal chambers. The space was a vast, open sanctuary of warmth and quiet luxury. A massive stone hearth roared continuously with a bright, golden fire, casting dancing, affectionate shadows across the walls. The floors were covered in thick, woven rugs that were impossibly soft beneath her bruised feet. He did not crowd her. The Emperor, a terrifying, destructive warlord who commanded armies of thousands, navigated his own domestic space with the careful, agonizingly slow precision of a man terrified of breaking fragile glass. He stood near the archway, his broad, armored chest rising and falling evenly, the heavy, dark iron chains on his thick forearms clinking softly as he kept his hands firmly to himself. He did not command her to eat. He simply placed a steaming bowl of herbal broth on a heavy oak table and stepped back. The rich liquid tasted of roasted root vegetables, wild thyme, and a hint of smoked salt. It was the taste of life, of careful preservation. Every slow swallow sent a cascading wave of restorative heat through her starved frame, slowly waking the quiet, frozen depths of her strength that had withered in the freezing north. By the dawn of the 7th day, the brutal physical evidence of her torture began to fade. The raw, bleeding blisters on her palms closed, the skin knitting together under the application of rare southern salves. The hollow, starving cut of her cheekbones softened, her natural, aristocratic beauty slowly returning to the surface, yet a singular dark blemish remained. Elara sat on the edge of the massive silk-draped bed, staring into a tall, polished bronze mirror. The reflection looking back at her was no longer a broken vessel. She wore a flowing gown of deep crimson and spun gold, the fabric feeling like a gentle caress against her skin. But on the delicate curve of her pale neck, the crescent moon mating mark sat like a foul, rotting stain. It was the physical anchor to a dead, toxic past. Ignis stood quietly by the roaring hearth, watching her reflection with storm-glass grey eyes that burned with a restrained, protective fury. He could easily incinerate the entire northern hemisphere, but he could not magically erase the psychological scar of a forced wolf bond. That required her own active choice. "It is dead," the young woman whispered, raising her hand to gently touch the jagged, black lines of the mark. "But it is still heavy. It is a tether to a withering branch. My mate!" The sovereign rumbled softly, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm, heavy blanket. He did not step closer. He waited for her invitation. "The earth has already severed the root. You only need to cut the string." Elara lowered her hand. She closed her eyes, sinking deeply into the undisturbed silence of the warm chamber. She did not feel the freezing mud of the outer courtyard anymore. She did not feel the paralyzing fear of the Alpha's loud, booming commands. She felt only the deep, rhythmic pulse of her own ancient dragon mother blood, singing in perfect harmony with the golden hearth fire. Her inner wolf, fully awake and basking in the absolute security of the imperial keep, stepped forward in her mind, baring its teeth not in fear, but in profound, quiet strength. "I reject this bond," she spoke aloud. Her voice was not a trembling whisper. It was a clear, resonant bell ringing with undeniable authority. "I, Elara Thorn, reject Gavin Ironwood. I reject his blood. I reject his territory. I reject the bond that was forced upon me. I take back my shadow, and I leave him to the frost." The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently conclusive. The black crescent moon on her neck did not slowly fade. It ignited. A tiny brilliant spark of golden fire erupted from the very center of the scar. The flame did not burn her skin. It felt exactly like a drop of warm, soothing honey. The golden fire rapidly traced the jagged, ugly lines of the wolf mark, systematically consuming the toxic, blackened tissue. A foul, microscopic wisp of grey smoke rose from her neck and instantly dissolved into the clean, cedar-scented air of the chamber. When she opened her eyes and looked into the bronze mirror, the dark stain was completely gone. In its place was a beautiful, shimmering golden scale, perfectly smooth and radiant, marking her permanently as the true, undisputed mate of the Fire Dragon Emperor. She was not a hollow vessel, not used, not owned, chosen. The suffocating weight in her chest evaporated. The invisible, dragging chains of her past were permanently shattered. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her lungs expanding fully, freely, for the very first time in 3 years. Ignis let out a low, rumbling exhale, the heavy iron chains on his wrists shifting as he finally relaxed his brutally rigid posture. The golden light in his eyes flared with territorial pride, but he still did not rush forward to claim her. He simply bowed his head, honoring her strength, honoring her choice. Miles away in the freezing, unforgiving north, the exact moment the golden flame consumed the mark, the Ironwood territory suffered a catastrophic decay. The ancient, sacred harmony that Elara's pure blood had unknowingly maintained with the earth entirely shattered. The deep, subterranean reserves of the pack's water froze solid, splitting the stone wells wide open with deafening, explosive cracks. The fertile topsoil of the harvest fields instantly hardened into impenetrable, dead permafrost. The dense pine forests surrounding the keep withered overnight, their green needles turning black and dropping to the frozen earth like dead, rotting flies. The barren curse Gavin had so loudly, arrogantly projected onto his fated mate had violently rebounded, permanently infecting his entire kingdom. The earth had definitively closed its eyes to the wolf pack. The changing of the seasons meant nothing to a frozen wasteland, but in the southern valleys, time moved with vibrant life. 3 long months later, the devastating, brutal consequences of a broken sacred law arrived at the massive, obsidian gates of the Dragon Emperor's domain. Elara stood on the grand, sweeping balcony of the Imperial Citadel, her hands resting lightly on the smooth, warm stone of the balustrade. The afternoon sun bathed the southern valleys in a rich, golden light, highlighting the sprawling, prosperous cities of the Emperor's domain. She wore a breathtaking gown of deep crimson silk, heavily embroidered with intricate, glowing threads of pure gold that mirrored the divine light of the ancient spring of truth. On her head rested a delicate, incredibly beautiful crown of crystallized dragonfire. Her skin was flushed with perfect, radiant health, her dark hair shining with a vibrant, glossy luster. She was the true mate of the Fire Dragon Emperor, Unbinder, Reformer, and the undisputed anchor of a massive empire. A heavy, deliberate footstep sounded behind her. Ignis stepped onto the balcony, his massive frame blocking the wind. He did not wear his heavy battle armor today, but rather a simple, elegant tunic of dark linen that stretched tightly across his broad chest. The dark iron chains still wrapped heavily around his forearms, a permanent testament to his unwavering, voluntary restraint. He stepped up behind her, his chest brushing gently against her back, and wrapped his thick, muscular arms carefully around her waist. The young woman leaned back naturally, sinking into the intense, intoxicating heat of his solid body. The golden scale on her neck pulsed warmly, humming in perfect, instinctual harmony with the deep, rumbling purr vibrating in his chest. It was a quiet, domestic sanctuary, a moment of profound, untouchable safety. "There is a beggar at the lower gates, Elara," the sovereign murmured, his deep voice rumbling directly against her ear, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. "The border guards report that he claims to know you. He bears the stench of a starving wolf." Her iron-grey gaze remained perfectly calm. She did not tense. The iron fortress in her mind had not rusted. It had been permanently fortified with dragon fire. "Bring him to the courtyard." 10 minutes later, Elara stood at the top of the grand obsidian staircase leading down to the lower courtyard. Ignis stood exactly 1 pace behind her, functioning as an immovable, a terrifying shadow of absolute protection. The heavy iron gates screeched open. A figure stumbled into the sunlit courtyard, flanked tightly by 4 massive, heavily armed dragon guards. It was Gavin Ironwood. The sight of the former Alpha King was a shocking, pathetic testament to absolute, systemic ruin. He was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, towering warlord who had proudly smashed his goblet on the high table during the winter banquet. His thick, majestic direwolf pelt was gone, replaced by filthy, ragged, moth-eaten furs that hung loosely on his severely emaciated frame. His broad chest had caved in, his cheeks were hollow and gaunt, and his amber eyes were bloodshot, frantic, and devoid of their former dominant light. He looked exactly like a starving, desperate scavenger. The ruined man collapsed to his knees the moment he saw her standing at the top of the stairs. The rough, volcanic stone tore at his dirty trousers, but he did not seem to feel the physical pain. He stared up at Ilara, his eyes widening in sheer incomprehensible awe at her radiant divine transformation. "Ilara," he gasped, his voice cracking horribly, lacking the booming, commanding authority it once possessed. "Please." She did not flinch. She did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. She looked down at him with the cold detachment of a queen observing a stranger. "You are trespassing in the Emperor's domain, Gavin. Speak quickly." "My pack is dying," the Alpha choked out, tears of sheer desperation violently spilling over his hollow cheeks and freezing in his filthy beard. "The earth has turned against us. The wells are cracked. The soil is dead rock. The winter has not ended. It has been snowing for 3 months. We are starving in the dark." "And your fertile Luna?" Ilara asked, her voice dangerously quiet, slicing cleanly through his pathetic sobbing. "Did Cynthia Sterling not bring the blessing of life to your fields?" Gavin physically flinched at the name, a spasm of agonizing regret twisting his gaunt features. She was a fraud, a lying, treacherous snake. When the famine hit, she stole the last of the royal treasury and fled into the death forest. The border guards found her frozen body a week later. She had nothing. She was nothing. He dragged himself forward on his bruised knees, his dirty hands desperately reaching out toward the bottom step of the staircase, though the dragon guards instantly leveled their heavy spears at his throat, stopping his progress. "I was blind," the broken king wailed, his pride completely, utterly shattered. The man who had demanded her absolute submission was now publicly groveling in the dirt. "I was an arrogant fool. The ancient magic punished me for casting you aside. I see it now. You are the true queen. You have always been the true Luna. Please, forgive me. Restore the bond. Come back to the Ironwood Keep. Your touch can thaw the soil. Your presence can save my people. I will give you everything. I will kneel to you every day." He was weeping uncontrollably, a messy display of complete emotional collapse. He expected her to show mercy. He expected the quiet, compassionate woman who had spent years healing his pack to instantly forgive his cruelty, to rush down the stairs and absolve him of his horrific sins. Ilara did not move. She did not cry. She did not feel a single, lingering shred of the agonizing pain that had once hollowed out her chest. She looked at the groveling, weeping man, and she felt nothing but a cold, heavy finality. "The rejection ceremony was supposed to break me," she stated quietly. Her voice was not raised, but it carried effortlessly across the silent courtyard, echoing with the crushing weight of undeniable truth. "You stood before your entire court and stripped me of my dignity. You handed my mother's silver crown to a fraud. You sent me to haul freezing water in a grey linen dress, hoping I would freeze to death so you would not have to look at your own failure. I was wrong," he screamed, hitting his bloody forehead against the stone floor. "I beg you." "You demanded that I yield," Ilara continued, her storm-grey eyes devoid of mercy. "You demanded that I accept my displacement, and I did." She took one slow, deliberate step down the obsidian stairs, the heavy, crimson silk of her gown dragged elegantly against the stone. "I accepted your decree, Alpha," she said, explicitly using his old title as a weapon of permanent separation. "I took my shadow elsewhere. I survived the frost, and I will never, ever return to a world of teeth that only values a woman when she is useful." Gavin looked up, his face contorted in absolute despair. He saw the cold, impenetrable iron in her eyes. He finally, truly understood that the bond was irreversibly severed. The woman he had thrown away was gone. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered pathetically, a broken king entirely out of options. Ilara looked down at him one last time, her expression a flawless, carved mask of stone. "You will freeze." She turned her back on him. She did not look over her shoulder as the dragon guards stepped forward, forcefully dragging the weeping, screaming Alpha King out of the courtyard and violently tossing him back out into the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. His frantic, desperate pleas faded quickly behind the heavy slam of the massive iron gates, permanently cutting him off from the warmth, the light, and the life he had so foolishly discarded. Ignis stepped forward, his massive hand gently finding her waist, his thumb stroking a slow, incredibly comforting circle against the crimson silk. The intense, fiery heat of his touch completely eradicated the lingering chill of the confrontation. "Are you all right, Ilara?" he asked, his molten gold eyes scanning her face with deep, anxious protectiveness. Ilara leaned her head back against his broad, solid shoulder. The heavy crown of crystallized dragonfire rested securely on her dark hair. 3 months ago, she had been a woman in a grey linen dress, kneeling before her own displacement, shivering in the freezing mud of an ungrateful pack. Now she was the undisputed mate of the South, unbinder of old magic, and most importantly, she was loved fully, freely, without condition or curse. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. "I am exactly where I am meant to be," she whispered, smiling softly as she closed her eyes and listened to the steady, enduring beat of the Emperor's heart. The thawing of a frozen soul takes time, but some warmth is built to last forever. The old ironwood forests may have withered into ash, but a new, golden dawn had risen in the south, proving that true value cannot be stripped away by a blind king's mandate. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed the journey, from freezing betrayal to the absolute, triumphant warmth of the Dragon Emperor's hearth, please leave a comment sharing what you would have said to the groveling alpha, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of quiet survival, deep comfort, and sweet vindication.